It was the kind of quiet that felt wrong. Not peaceful. Not serene. But hollow. A silence so absolute it pressed against your chest and made your ears strain for anything, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of a bird, even the distant whine of a generator. But there was nothing. Not in those mountains. Not at that altitude. Not at that hour. The air was razor thin and brittle, the kind that sliced into your lungs when you breathed too deep. Snow clung to the rock ledges like old ghosts, reluctant to melt even under the sun's retreat. The tree line had thinned an hour ago, and now there was only open granite and wind, except the wind had stopped too. Sergeant Daniel McAllister had just the strap on his rucksack for the third time in 5 minutes, not because it needed adjusting, but because it was something to do. Something to keep the growing unease in his chest from blooming into full-blown nerves. Behind him, the rest of the recon unit moved in practiced silence, boots crunching against frost-crusted stone, rifles cradled tight against their chests, eyes up. They were trained for this kind of terrain, high-altitude movement, rapid extraction, night operations. And yet, something about this mission had felt off from the beginning. The last transmission from Echo 7 had come 72 hours ago. No signs of a firefight. No SOS beacon. No GPS ping. The team had simply gone dark. Now it was up to McAllister's squad to find them, or whatever was left. The briefing had been clinical. A cave system suspected of harboring insurgent stockpiles. Known patrol routes. Satellite photos. Radio logs. The usual. But none of that explained the low-grade dread that had hung over the team since they were dropped off by Hello the night before. Ahead, Staff Sergeant Hale raised a fist, signaling a stop. Everyone froze. McAllister scanned the ridgeline. There, tucked into the side of the mountain like a wound, was the cave. It wasn't the first cave McAllister had seen on deployment. Afghanistan was riddled with them, networks like arteries running through the bones of the land. But this one felt wrong. It was too perfectly shaped, the mouth a symmetrical oval that didn't match the jagged chaos of the surrounding rock. No erosion lines. No water stains. Just shadow. Deep, still, and wide enough to swallow a tank. The rest of the unit caught up in a slow, tight formation. No one spoke. No one needed to. Every man felt it, the pressure, the weight of that silence pressing down on them like the air was holding its breath. Then, somewhere just behind them, came the click. McAllister's muscles tightened instantly. Not the click of a weapon. Not exactly. It was too soft, too deliberate. Like metal being tested. Or mimicked. He turned, scanning the slope, the frost-glazed shrubs, the crevices in the rocks. Nothing. You feel that? He murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper behind his scarf. Hale didn't answer right away. He just stared at the cave, his jaw tight. Yeah, he finally said. I feel it. Then came the smell. It was faint at first. Just a thread on the air, musty, sweet, and heavy. Like something rotting deep underground. Like wet leather left to mold in the sun. McAllister tried to breathe shallow, but it clung to the inside of his nostrils, sank into the lining of his throat. No one had mentioned this in the briefing. Diaz, get eyes on the approach, Hale said, voice low but sharp. Ames, cover the rear. I want a perimeter. Now. The men moved automatically, training kicking in. But McAllister stayed rooted for a second longer, eyes locked on the black mouth of the cave. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. There was something deeper in it. A sense of movement. Of presence. He blinked, trying to clear the cold burn from his eyes. That's when he saw it. Just for a moment. 2 points of dull yellow glint, low and wide apart. Like eyes. Watching. Not blinking. Not retreating. Just there. A breath caught in his throat. Then, gone. He opened his mouth to say something, to warn Hale, to raise his weapon, to do something. But from the dark, something moved. It didn't lurch. It didn't charge. It stepped, with intention, with weight, with sound. The crunch of gravel. The scrape of something solid dragging behind it. The shape was massive. At least 12 feet tall, maybe more. A silhouette against the cave's inner lightlessness, human-like but wrong. The arms were too long. The shoulders sloped forward like a predator on the brink of lunging. Its skin, if that's what it was, looked like bark soaked in blood and dust. And the eyes. They didn't shine. They glowed. Then came the voice. It didn't speak. It vibrated, a sound that wasn't heard so much as felt in the sternum, like standing too close to an explosion. A low, guttural growl that rolled over the rocks and into their bones. Contact. Hale barked, finally snapping the spell. And then the world exploded into noise. McAllister hit the dirt, weapon raised, breath hitching as the air filled with gunfire, and that thing began to run. Toward them. Straight out of the cave. The last thing McAllister saw before muzzle flash blinded his vision was the thing raising something high over its head, a spear, thick and sharp and ancient, and the look in its eyes. Not hate. Not rage. But something colder. Recognition. And then it was upon them. There's a misconception civilians have when they hear someone say they're going to the field. It conjures up images of a grassy meadow, maybe some tents, a little mud, but otherwise calm, a rustic weekend with camo and discipline. That's not what it means. At least not for the Marine Corps. Not for recon. When we went to the field, we didn't pitch tents or sing around a campfire. We didn't camp. We disappeared into the terrain, became a part of it. We lived in the dirt, patrolled until our legs trembled, and learned to sleep half alert, rain soaking through gear that never really dried. My first real introduction to what field life meant came when I was stationed in Hawaii. Sounds glamorous, right? Beaches, palm trees, sunsets. But once you left the postcard behind and headed into the interior, into the jungle, that's when you saw the real Hawaii. Dense, suffocating foliage. Humid air that clung to your skin like wet gauze. Nights so dark, you could barely see your hand in front of your face, even with NVGs. Our gear weighed upwards of 80 pounds. Food, water, fuel, extra batteries, radios, weapons, each of us looked like overburdened ants moving single file through a sea of green. The convoy rides out were filled with nervous chatter, the kind of banter that died down quickly as the jungle swallowed the trail. You never knew what the next week would bring. Only that it would hurt. Being recon meant there were no comforts. No tents. We built shelters out of tarps and tree branches, or we didn't bother at all. You learned to love the lean-to, or you learned to love misery. The ground was your mattress, your rifle, your pillow. And above you? Darkness. Nothing but leaves and stars, if you were lucky. That was Hawaii. California's field was different. Less humid. More bite. Rattlesnakes hidden beneath rocks. Cacti that clung to your uniform like tiny barbed fists. The sun was brutal in the day, but it was the nights that got you. Cold. Still. Endless. You'd think a desert would be silent, but it's not. The wind moves like a whisper, carrying things you're not sure you really heard. You sleep with your boots on, weapon cradled to your chest, listening for the crunch of something that doesn't belong. But the field in Bridgeport, California? That was something else entirely. Bridgeport was a different kind of beast. High altitude. Rugged. Raw. It wasn't just terrain, it was resistance. Like the mountains didn't want you there. Like the very land bristled at your presence. The Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center sits nestled between peaks that rise like serrated knives into the sky. The kind of place that made you believe the earth still had secrets. We arrived in the fall, when the wind already carried the bite of early snow. The air was thinner, colder, cleaner in a way that burned your lungs with every breath. It was the kind of cold that didn't feel right on your skin, not just chill, but ancient. Like it had been frozen there long before you ever arrived. The first few days were about acclimatization. Adjusting to the altitude, the thinness of the air. They briefed us on high-altitude pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs, and other altitude-related risks. We were told hallucinations could happen. Oxygen deprivation plays tricks on the brain, especially when you're running ops on 2 hours of sleep and chasing adrenaline. Some of the older guys whispered stories. Not just about mountain lions or frostbite, but about things they'd seen. Things no one wanted to write down in a report. Pale figures. Shadows that moved against the wind. Sounds that didn't echo right. I took it for hazing at first, the way any new guy learns to tune out the ghost stories. Until those stories started lining up. Our unit, Alpha 2 of 1st CEB, was partnered with a Victor unit for joint operations. Training exercises. Simulated patrols. The usual. We were engineers. Support. That meant building and blowing things up. Setting up shelters, breaking down OPs, hauling gear where it didn't want to go. Bridgeport was our proving ground. We rotated through positions, setting up base camps, learning how to survive on mountains that didn't care if you were there or not. Days were long. Nights were longer. You'd lie in your bag, staring up at a sky littered with stars and still feel like something was looking back down. Like the mountain was awake. And then there was LZ Owl. LZ Owl was the highest landing zone in the training area. A broad shelf carved into the mountainside, surrounded by towering pines and sheer rock. That's where we made our shelter, tarp strung tight against a rock face, anchored with boulders and thick wooden stakes. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the wind off. We'd wrap ourselves in sleeping bags and bury into the lean-to like animals, grateful for any insulation. That night, it started snowing just after chow. Big flakes. Slow and quiet. The kind of snowfall that covers your gear before you even finish brushing your teeth. The world got quiet again, but not in a peaceful way. In a wrong way. Like everything around us was holding its breath. There were 3 of us under the tarp, me, another lance corporal, and our water specialist, nicknamed Water Dog. He was a good guy. A little too fond of his bayonet. Always showing it off. Kept attaching it to his M4 even when we weren't in combat mode. I thought it was dumb, but harmless. Around 10 p.m., I woke up to the sound of a charging handle being pulled. A clean, mechanical clack. Loud enough to snap me out of a half-sleep instantly. You don't hear that sound unless someone's chambering around, or pretending to. Either way, it's not a noise you want to hear when everyone's supposed to be asleep. I sat up, heart pounding, hands reaching for my own rifle. Our weapons were beside us, untouched. Only Water Dog's was out of sight, around the other side of the tree. "Is that you?" I whispered, barely louder than the wind. He groaned, rustled out of his bag, and looked at me. "What? That sound. Was that you racking your weapon?" He blinked. Shook his head. "Nah, man. Wasn't me." Something twisted in my gut. I wasn't scared, not yet, but I was alert. My training was kicking in. The jungle back in Hawaii had taught me how to listen for movement. This was different. There should have been movement. A crunch of boots. The rustle of gear. But there was nothing. Just that sound, and the feeling that it hadn't been meant to scare us. It had been. Curious. I crawled out from under the tarp, blade in hand. My knife wasn't just for show. It was habit. You don't confront a threat with empty hands. The cold bit into my face as I stood, scanning the shadows. Snow had already blanketed the ground. Visibility was poor, but not impossible. Then my sergeant spotted me. He came stomping over, bundled in his parka, looking both pissed and confused. "What the hell are you doing?" he asked. I told him what we heard. Asked if it had been one of the infantry guys messing around. "No," he said. "I was about to ask you the same thing." He checked with the fire watch nearby. They'd seen nothing. Heard nothing. No one owned up to it. My sergeant gave me a look, one that said, "Go back to bed before this turns into paperwork." So I did. And that might have been the end of it. Except the next morning, our tarp was gone. Not collapsed. Not torn. Gone. The boulders we'd used to weigh it down, vanished. The stakes, ripped clean from the ground. No drag marks. No trails. Just gone. Our gear was intact. Nothing stolen. Just exposed to the elements like it had been uncovered on purpose. That's when the sergeant finally told us what he'd seen. After sending me back to bed, had looked up, toward the top of the rock face behind our lean-to, and spotted something. A figure. Pale. Human-shaped, but not human. Naked. Hairless. Watching. Just watching. And the moment it knew it had been seen, it disappeared, slipping back over the ledge like a ghost folding into stone. He hadn't told us because he didn't believe it himself. But that morning, with the tarp gone and the snow still falling, he told us everything. None of us spoke for a long while. We just stood there, surrounded by silence, the wind brushing fresh snow against our boots. And up on that ridge, where the thing had been, nothing moved. Not yet. The snow had started falling in thin, slow sheets as night settled over LZ Owl. At 9,000 feet above sea level, the cold didn't creep in, it dropped like a hammer. The wind carved its way between the trees and boulders, whispering through the pines in a rhythm that felt older than the mountains themselves. The tarps snapped against the gusts as we struggled to secure them, their corners flapping like frightened birds. Our breath rose in white clouds, catching in the headlamps as we worked quickly, hands numbed by the chill, our voices muffled beneath layers of fleece and fatigue. We'd been patrolling all day, climbing steep, rocky inclines, cutting paths through icy brush, setting up OPs that we tore down hours later just to move again. Now, finally, we were allowed to stop. To rest. The only requirement, keep our positions tactically sound. So we set our shelter up against a massive granite rock face, using it as a windbreak, staking our tarps low and tight around a gnarled pine that rose from a seam in the stone. The boulders we used as anchors were the size of small backpacks. It wasn't elegant, but it would hold. The three of us, 2 engineers and the water dog, tucked ourselves beneath the lean-to structure we'd made, the tarps angled to shed the snow as it fell. Our gear was piled close, rifles within arm's reach. Somewhere beyond our sight line, the rest of the platoon was setting up their own shelters, but we couldn't hear them anymore. Just the wind. Just the cracking of ice in the branches. The water dog was fiddling with his bayonet again. Had shown it off earlier, twisting it onto his M4 with a grin like a kid on Christmas. It wasn't standard issue, looked custom, maybe ordered online. I remember thinking it was too heavy to be practical, but he was proud of it. He kept it sharp. Obsessed, almost. We burrowed into our sleeping bags, layered beneath the tarps, the cold sneaking in through the seams. The world became quiet, compressed. The snow dampened everything. Soon, the only sound was the low rush of wind scraping across the stone above us. My thoughts started drifting. I felt my muscles loosening, my heartbeat slowing. The first stages of sleep. And then, a metallic clack. Loud. Sharp. The unmistakable sound of a rifle's charging handle being pulled back. My eyes snapped open. It was close. 10 feet, maybe less. My heart thudded in my ears. I didn't move right away, just listened, hoping it wouldn't repeat, hoping I had imagined it. But the silence that followed made it worse. I reached out slowly, brushing against my rifle. Still where I left it. So was my buddy's. Only the water dog's rifle was out of sight, resting on the far side of the tree, near the edge of the tarp where only he could reach it. I hissed his name. A rustle. Then his voice, low and groggy. What? Was that you? Did you mess with your rifle just now? A pause. No, I was asleep. Now I was sitting up. Cold air slid under my gear as I moved, but I didn't care. My instincts kicked in, hard. That wasn't a sound you heard by accident. Someone had to be right there, standing almost inside our shelter. I grabbed my knife, not my rifle, not yet. I didn't want to shoot a buddy over a dumb prank. But my grip was tight. I crawled out from under the tarp. The snow hit me instantly, soft and blinding. I blinked hard, scanning the tree line. My boots crunched lightly as I moved forward a few steps. Visibility was poor, but my eyes were adjusting. I expected to see someone, some infantry guy playing a joke. Maybe crouched, trying not to laugh. There was no one. Just shadow. Trees. Snowflakes catching in my eyelashes. Then a voice behind me, Oscar. I turned. It was the sergeant, standing a few meters away, arms crossed against the cold. His silhouette loomed dark against the pale ground. What the hell are you doing? I lowered the knife slightly. Did you hear that? Like a weapon racking? Yeah. Thought it was one of you. It wasn't. The sergeant turned and walked toward the firewatch post, two more Marines standing silently near a tree. I watched as he spoke to them, his voice low. Then he returned. Wasn't them either. He nodded toward the shelter. Get back in. Try to get some sleep. I hesitated. Then ducked back under the tarp. But sleep didn't come. I lay there, staring up at the canvas above, feeling the wind shift direction, listening for anything, footsteps, breathing, another click. Nothing. When I opened my eyes again, it was morning. And our tarp was gone. Not ripped. Not folded back. Gone. It lay collapsed over our gear, like a shed skin. The boulders we'd used as anchors were missing. Not rolled aside, gone. The stakes, too. As if someone had pulled them all out carefully and walked away with them. We sat up slowly, still in our bags, the snow crusted lightly over the gear. Confused. Cautious. The sergeant returned as we were trying to piece it together. He looked tired. Pale. He stared at the collapsed tarp, then spoke, voice low. There's something I didn't tell you last night. He didn't look at us when he said it. After I told you to go back to sleep. I saw something. We didn't speak. I looked up, he said, toward the top of the rock face behind the tree. And there was something there. The wind stirred the tarps at our feet. Human-shaped, he said. But wrong. Thin. Bald. Eyes like reflections. It was crouched up there, watching. What did it do? It ducked. Fast. Like it knew I saw it. He paused. I thought maybe I imagined it. Cold air. Sleep deprivation. That's why I didn't say anything. But now. We all turned to look up. The rock face behind our shelter was slick with melting snow. The pine tree arched slightly to the right, its bark scarred with faint gouges that hadn't been there yesterday. None of us spoke. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied, one of the animal packers, maybe. But it sounded off. Panicked. The wind shifted again, colder this time. That night, none of us slept. We stayed huddled close, weapons in our laps, eyes flicking to the shadows above the rock. We didn't joke about skinwalkers after that. We didn't joke about anything. Snow had started falling harder by the time Corporal Oscar zipped his sleeping bag back up to his neck. The wind, high and needling, cut through the thin canopy of tarp they'd rigged against the trunk of the rock-faced tree. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, mostly. Tarps angled like crude wings off the tree's base, weighed down with fist-sized rocks and a few makeshift wooden stakes. They'd wrapped themselves like burritos beneath it, bodies stiff from fatigue and cold. The mountain's silence felt so complete it bordered on unnatural, broken only by the rustle of sleeping bags and the periodic hiss of snow brushing across nylon. Oscar had always hated Bridgeport. Not the training itself, that was standard, but the feel of the place. The air was thinner, which always left him lightheaded. And there was a smell up there. Not just pine and snowmelt, but something stale. Like the inside of an old crypt. Most of the guys laughed it off, blaming altitude sickness or the stories they'd heard, skinwalkers, ghosts, creatures in the woods. But sometimes when Oscar closed his eyes, he swore he could feel something watching from just beyond the trees. Not a presence, exactly. More like an absence of everything else. Like something had pressed its face against the world and everything recoiled. He must have dozed off for about an hour before a metallic sound snapped him awake. Sharp. Mechanical. Familiar. A rifle. Specifically, the racking of a charging handle. Oscar froze. He could feel his heartbeat jump up into his throat, pulse roaring in his ears. It wasn't like someone was walking or adjusting gear, this was deliberate. A full draw and reset of the bolt. And worse, it wasn't coming from near his own weapon or the guy next to him. The sound had come from the far side of the tree, where Water Dog had bedded down. At first, he told himself it was just the water specialist screwing around again. The guy was obsessed with his bayonet, always cleaning it, clicking it in and out of its scabbard like a fidget toy. Maybe he was playing with it again, showing off for nobody. Oscar whispered across the dark, his breath immediately fogging. "Yo. That you?" A grunt. Then movement. Water Dog sat up, confused. "What?" he said, rubbing at his face. "You messing with your rifle?" Oscar asked. "No, man. I was asleep." A hard chill rippled through Oscar's spine. He grabbed his knife, flicked the safety off his caber, and crawled out into the freezing dark. His boots crunched faintly against ice-crusted needles. The tarp rustled behind him as his gear shifted. He felt every crackle like thunder. The tree loomed above him, casting a long shadow up the side of the rock face, pale in the moonlight. On the far side, nothing moved. Water Dog's rifle lay untouched. Snow dusted its stock. He was about to call out again when a deeper voice startled him from behind. "Oscar." Sergeant's voice, low but tense. Oscar turned, knife still in hand. "Yeah. What the hell are you doing?" "I thought I heard, did you hear anything? Like someone racking their rifle?" Sergeant's face was unreadable in the half-light. "Yeah. Thought it was one of you. Wasn't?" Oscar shook his head. The sergeant grumbled and turned toward the fire watch post where the nearby infantry were stationed. Oscar waited, watching the woods, listening. No footsteps. No breathing. Just the wind slicing through the branches and his own rapid heartbeat. Sergeant came back, shaking his head. Firewatch didn't hear anything. They weren't moving either. Oscar exhaled and returned to the tarp. As he zipped himself back into the bag, he tried to push it from his mind. Could have been anything. An echo. A tree branch shifting. Some stupid prank. Sleep came in fractured pieces. At first light, Oscar woke to a strange quiet. Not the usual hush of snow or early morning fatigue. something different. The tarp had collapsed. The rocks were gone. The stakes too. Tarps lay scattered, twisted, like they'd been deliberately pulled away from the tree. Their gear, soaked and half buried in snow, looked as if it had been dragged. Oscar sat up, brushing frost from his face, scanning the ground. No prints. No scuff marks. Nothing. What the hell? One of the other engineers muttered, groggy and annoyed. Then the sergeant approached, face pale. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Just looked at the tree. Then the rock face above. I wasn't gonna say anything, he started. Thought maybe it was nothing. But after seeing this. He paused, ran a hand over his jaw, then looked back at Oscar. Last night, after you crawled back in, I saw something up there. Oscar followed his gaze. On the rock, the sergeant said. Bald. Pale. Human looking. But not. Just standing up there. Eyes glowing like glass. It ducked back when I looked at it. Quick. Too quick. Oscar didn't respond. He remembered a video he'd seen online once, a guy filming the roof of his house at night. Claimed a skinwalker kept climbing on it. The thing had ducked the moment it realized it was seen. Almost exactly the same. Later that day, nobody spoke about it. They trained. They marched. They ate their tasteless rations in silence. But everyone felt it, the weight of something unspoken, crawling under their skin. Then came Fort McCoy. The second story, from a National Guardsman, brought it all flooding back. A different location. Different terrain. But the same feeling. The guardsman had set off into the woods alone, doing nightland navigation, one of the few tasks the army let you perform solo. Standard course, plot points on a map, use your compass, and move through the terrain in darkness. No lights unless absolutely necessary. And if you did use one, it had to be red to preserve night vision. Everything was about discipline, concealment, and silence. Had done the route before. Knew the stakes. Literally. But something was different this time. He described the terrain as dead quiet. Cloud cover heavy. Wind slipping in and out like it was thinking about changing its mind. Had reached a clearing where prairie met forest, open space punctuated with dead trees. One stood out, split halfway up, a natural perch about 15 feet off the ground. And there it was. A silhouette. Head. Shoulders. Still. He assumed it was another soldier. Maybe someone messing around. So he walked closer. Asked if they were okay. Then the shadow moved. Twitch. Twist. Turned toward him. And then, with a flash of moonlight, the details snapped into view, a long, stretched frame. Bald. Emaciated. Arms curled around the tree like a spider. No eyes or mouth visible, just a pinched, expressionless face. Watching. He froze. And then it moved. It didn't jump. It slid, almost dropped, down the tree in a single, impossible motion. Landing on all fours, it shot toward the brush. He fumbled with his headlamp, trying to switch from red to white. In the strobing flashes, he caught glimpses, an elongated limb. A crouch. A stillness too still. Then nothing. Silence returned. But the feeling didn't. Every instinct screamed that it was still there. Watching. Waiting. He began inching toward the road, trying to avoid the direct line of trees. Trying not to panic. Then movement. To his left. Then his right. It was pacing him. Following his steps, always just out of sight. Each time he moved, it moved. When he stopped, it stopped. Breathing was like trying to inhale fog. The air wouldn't fill his lungs properly. And still, it tracked him. He started to run. Branches whipped across his face. Mud sucked at his boots. He tripped, twice. Got up, kept running. Somewhere behind him, in the trees, the thing darted silently from trunk to trunk. Then, upward. A branch snapped high overhead. He looked up and saw it. Peering from 30 feet up, its face like an oval of porcelain, half in shadow. He ran again. Harder this time. Never looked back. Eventually, he reached the road. Made it back to base, face streaked with dirt, lungs heaving. He told no one. Not really. He lied, said he got lost. That was easier. Simpler. Safer. But when Oscar heard this story later, his stomach dropped. Different man. Different woods. Same creature. Whatever it was. It was no longer a coincidence. Absolutely. Based on the tone, structure, and narrative from the original transcript, here is the immersive expansion for. The briefing room back on base was quiet, save for the low mechanical hum of the overhead projector and the occasional shuffle of boots on concrete. The incident at Bridgeport had made its rounds, not in official reports, but whispered between fire teams and retold around smoke pits. What had once been laughed off as just another night in the field was now growing into something more persistent, something no one could quite dismiss. Corporal Oscar sat in the back row, arms crossed over his chest, jaw set tight. His unit was rotating out of the field and undergoing their standard post-deployment evaluations. But the story he carried, about the thing on the ridge, about the stolen tarps and that eerie, metallic sound in the night, was starting to itch at the corners of his mind like a wound healing wrong. The medical officer ran down a checklist of symptoms for high-altitude exposure, noting things like confusion, hallucinations, and shortness of breath. But none of it fit. Oscar hadn't imagined the weight of his bayonet in his hand that night. He hadn't hallucinated the noise that startled all of them awake or the way the cold suddenly shifted, as if the entire mountain had inhaled. After the session, Oscar waited until the last of the guys filed out. Then he approached the corpsman and asked, casually, if anyone else had reported strange dreams or memory gaps after Bridgeport. The corpsman paused, searching his face for a beat longer than comfortable. "You're not the first to ask," he finally said, voice low. "But we're not recording that kind of data officially. Just between us, something's off about that place." Oscar didn't push. He simply nodded, thanked the guy, and walked out into the midday glare. The sun felt wrong, too bright, too ordinary for what was sitting just beneath the surface of his thoughts. That night, in the silence of his bunk, he opened his encrypted email and drafted a message. Not to his command. Not to the press. But to someone who had reached out once before, a YouTuber, oddly enough, who collected stories like the one Oscar had buried beneath a thick crust of military discipline and personal doubt. He didn't include every detail. Just enough to make it real. The response came back within hours. "You're not alone." At Fort McCoy, the same kind of unease was taking root, but it didn't blossom immediately. The National Guardsman who encountered the creature in the tree, he didn't tell anyone at first. Not during the debrief, not in the bus ride back. He let the silence swallow it. But weeks later, after a restless string of nights and a growing sensitivity to sudden noises, he started pulling threads. He reviewed maps of the training site, trying to pinpoint the clearing where the encounter happened. He even emailed the logistics officer for access to satellite images under the pretext of checking land navigation routes for future drills. What he saw made him pause. The split tree was there, just as he remembered. But there was something odd in one of the images, an unmarked trail leading out from the clearing, one that wasn't on the training map. The next weekend, under the guise of planning a solo ruck session, he returned. The woods were the same, in the way that a scar never fully fades. The clearing appeared just past the ridge where his breath had caught weeks ago. The tree stump remained, weathered and hollow. He walked the perimeter slowly, noting impressions in the underbrush, flat spaces where something heavy might have knelt. He crouched and pressed a hand to the ground. Still damp, faintly warm, though no sunlight touched this part of the woods. And no animals stirred. Following the unmarked trail, he moved deeper until the silence became unnatural. Trees leaned in too closely. Every snapped twig echoed too loudly, even against his own restrained breathing. Half an hour in, he found a copse of trees that seemed off. The bark was stripped in long vertical lines, not like claw marks, but something more deliberate. At the base of one trunk lay a discarded money bag, partially torn, the kind issued during training. It wasn't old, no mold, no water damage. Someone had been here. Or something. He turned back. Later, sitting at his desk, he wrote everything down. Not in a report. In a journal he never intended to share. The moment he recounted the shape's pinched face and how it dropped from the tree like a shadow slinking off its perch, something clicked. These were not isolated events. Meanwhile, the YouTuber who had received Oscar's email began threading the stories together. Cross-referencing unit locations, training dates, weather reports. Dozens of messages flooded in, some detailed, some fragmented. Most were anonymous. They described pale limbs darting between trees, eye shine without a source, missing equipment, or faint hissing sounds in the middle of the night. One common thread emerged: elevation. Every confirmed report took place in mountainous or hilly terrain. Areas difficult to patrol. Regions thick with tree cover and prone to temperature drops that muffled sound. These were places where a human might miss something, where a creature might not need to hide as much as simply exist in the periphery. Another pattern: gear displacement. In story after story, soldiers described finding their packs open, gear rearranged, but not stolen. It was as if the thing, whatever it was, had been inspecting them. Studying. Understanding what they carried. Then there were the sounds. The mimicry. The Marine at Bridgeport had thought he heard a charging handle being pulled. The guardsman at McCoy described a cracking branch that sounded too sharp, too timed. One Navy medic emailed with a story from a separate training event in the Pacific Northwest. He and his partner had heard coughing in the woods. Human sounding. Rhythmic. But when they investigated, no one was there. And it had been raining. No footprints. Just that faint, unsettling cough echoing between the trees like a glitch in the dark. The YouTuber compiled everything into a running document: maps, timelines, elevation markers, and audio samples from his audience. He reached out to a retired tracker with experience in wilderness survival and asked for a review. The man listened to the sounds and said only, "That's not a man. That's not even a predator I know." He added, "Predators don't play with you. They don't come back multiple times unless you're prey. And they don't rearrange your gear." Back on base, Oscar spoke to another Marine, a guy who'd done a rotation through Bridgeport the year prior. Casual conversation, just small talk about how miserable the cold had been up there. "You ever hear anything weird at LZ Owl?" Oscar asked, testing the waters. The guy stopped mid-laugh. "You mean the owl that doesn't hoot?" Oscar raised a brow. "Every time we bivouacked near that zone, we'd hear what sounded like an owl. But it was always exactly the same. No variation. Like a soundboard clip." Oscar felt his stomach tighten. Couple guys swore they saw something in the trees, just after midnight. But you know how it is. No one wants to be that guy in the briefing. He did know. Oscar reached into his pocket and pressed a thumb against the small recorder Head started carrying. This wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about not feeling crazy. Because something was out there. And more of them were beginning to see it. There's something strange about the way silence lingers after an encounter like that. Not just any silence, the kind that follows you, sticks in your boots, breathes through your hair when the wind stops moving. Both Oscar and the guardsman had their experiences, but what followed wasn't closure, it was a gnawing need to understand. At Fort McCoy, after the adrenaline ebbed and the silence returned, the lieutenant said he spent the next 2 days walking through that same terrain, alone, in daylight. He was looking not for the creature, because how do you track something you don't believe in, but for signs that might ground the whole event in reality. A broken branch. Deep tracks. Shreds of bark or some logical explanation like another soldier messing around. But there was nothing. Not a single boot print that didn't match his own. He didn't report it. Who would he tell? The brass would laugh it off or pull him out of rotation for a psych eval. And in the military, perception is currency. If they think you're unstable, you lose your edge. He did mention it, briefly, to another officer who'd been on the course with him that night. The response, a long pause, a slow nod, and then, yeah. I've heard things too. That simple admission turned into a series of quiet, private conversations. Not official debriefs, just beer after shift sort of talks, murmured exchanges in hallways and over paperbacks in the barracks. Stories surfaced, soldiers claiming they'd heard pacing outside their hooches at night, heavy but deliberate. A figure spotted at the tree lean during low-light exercises, tall and motionless until it wasn't. One guard swore something followed him back from the latrine trail one night, but he never saw it, only felt the pressure in his chest, that primal whisper to run. Meanwhile, Oscar, back in Bridgeport, had his own questions. Had managed to keep the incident quiet among his platoon, but the tension was palpable. The joke stopped. Guys started sleeping with weapons closer to hand than usual. More than one Marine refused to set up camp near trees. One corporal began requesting fire watch for tents that didn't even need it, insisting he'd seen eyes in the dark, shimmering like animal reflections, but too high up for any deer. Oscar wasn't alone in wondering. After the TARP incident, and after his sergeant confessed what he'd seen, he started combing through online forums, quiet corners of the internet where combat veterans, hunters, hikers, and rural patrol officers posted anonymously. Not the fringe stuff, not the "I was abducted" types. These were guys who didn't scare easy. And some of their stories mirrored his own. Mountain sightings. Figures moving vertically across rock faces. Unnaturally long limbs. No clothing. No speech. Just presence. Staring. And then gone. Oscar bookmarked threads, collected posts, made a folder. He even wrote down timestamps from helmet cam footage, not because the creature ever showed up in the frame, but because he swore the audio went dead in certain places. The jungle ambient noise cut off entirely. Like something interfered. He finally brought it up with a corpsman, half-jokingly, about high-altitude effects, hypoxia-induced hallucinations. The corpsman didn't laugh. "Bridgeport's weird, man," he said. "You know how many calls I've taken where guys come down early with stress symptoms, but they're not talking. They just look like they've seen something that won't leave them alone." Oscar didn't push further. But the seed was planted. Back at Fort McCoy, the guardsman did something similar. He kept his questions off the record but started comparing notes during downtime. Other officers opened up when they realized he wasn't mocking. A prior enlisted logistics specialist mentioned a training night 2 years earlier where the radios kept cutting out every time they passed a particular sector. Their navigation markers were accurate, but patrols kept getting turned around. Trees seemed closer together than before. A squad leader swore the stars above changed pattern as they moved, like the forest itself had rotated. One guy, a retired instructor, told the guardsman about an encounter at an old training compound in Germany, said a group saw what looked like a person crawling vertically up a radio tower. Just a guy with no gear, no ropes, just climbing. Naked. Fast. Too fast. The common thread in every version of the story wasn't fear. It was confusion. And the silence after. In both Bridgeport and McCoy, the environmental oddities stood out. Radios fuzzed at the worst times. Static broke into channels with no origin. Gear shifted during the night. Heavy stones moved from where they'd been placed, stakes pulled from the ground with no sign of dragging or footprints. Oscar took to marking his perimeter with sticks wedged into the earth at precise angles, an old trick to gauge whether anything passed by while he slept. 3 nights in a row, the sticks were disturbed but not broken. Always shifted a few degrees clockwise. Not enough to trigger alarm, but enough that he noticed. On the 4th night, they were untouched, but his boots were wet, and he hadn't been near any water. It's these kinds of details that make people start to believe not in monsters, but in distortions. Glitches. Realities rubbing against each other where they shouldn't. By this point in both stories, the men were acting like observers, not participants. They went quiet. Hyper-aware. The jokes dried up. They slept less, moved more deliberately, flinched at sounds that wouldn't have bothered them weeks earlier. Oscar's water dog started double-knotting all his gear, even clipping his sleeping bag shut with carabiners. The lieutenant at McCoy began walking with his knife already drawn, not out of fear, he claimed, but out of muscle memory. Something about being watched made the normal rules of engagement feel distant, irrelevant. And it's here, right at this point in both men's timelines, where the investigation shifted from external to internal. They didn't need more stories. They needed to understand what the hell was changing in them. Why they couldn't shake the feeling that something had walked a little too close, and left its breath behind. Oscar, still on active duty, kept detailed logs in a notebook. Small things. The scent of the trees shifting between dawn and dusk. Whether the wildlife went silent. Whether his instincts twitched when they shouldn't have. At first, it felt ridiculous. Later, it felt necessary. The lieutenant? He submitted an unofficial report to a military folklore study group, not naming names, just summarizing observations. He never heard back, but a week later, a different officer asked him, very casually, if he believed in cryptids. That was the last time he brought it up. But privately, both men came to similar conclusions, they hadn't hallucinated. Whatever happened, it wasn't a trick of the dark or the mind. It was something tangible, something they both encountered in isolation and yet found others quietly echoing. Too many stories, too many patterns. He hadn't thought about the branch sound again until much later. At the time, it was just background noise, something tucked away under adrenaline and cold air. But in hindsight, that crack, that sharp snap overhead. It didn't belong to a tree giving way under the weight of ice or wind. No, the rhythm was wrong. It was too sudden. Too purposeful. Like something heavy and agile had launched itself from one point to another and didn't care if the forest heard it for a second. It was weeks after the Fort McCoy incident when he received the email. No subject line. No sender name, just a string of numbers and a .mil domain. He almost deleted it. But the message itself was short and strange enough to make him freeze. You weren't the only one. Look up the Black Hills file. The 1996 recon team. Keywords, white skins, radio loss, no official record. That night, long after he should have been asleep, he sat in his dim apartment with only the blue flicker of his laptop screen illuminating the room. He typed carefully. Slowly. Searching combinations of the words. Most yielded nothing but ghost stories, forum speculation, and old creepypasta posts. But one reference, a declassified training debrief scanned and uploaded to a veteran's archive, seemed to line up with the keywords. The language was careful, almost sterile. But if you read between the lines, it was unmistakable. The hair on his arm stood up. It was the radios that got him. Because during that night in the woods, before Head even made it to the tree line, he swore, had heard the faintest click of static. Not from his own gear. He didn't even have his comms on. It was like someone, or something, was pretending to be one of them. He hadn't trusted that memory until now. But this old report gave it weight. And then, in the weeks that followed, more messages came. First from other soldiers who'd heard him talk about his experience during training rotations. Then from a retired master sergeant who had served out west and claimed his unit saw a pale crawler on thermals once, twice the height of a man, moving unnaturally fast, only visible in the infrared spectrum. Another message included a blurry photograph. It showed a figure crouched on the edge of a boulder, limbs too long, eyes faintly glowing from a night vision lens. The metadata had been scrubbed. The sender wrote only. Found this in a private Discord thread. Taken near Yakima, Washington. Don't share it. Just keep your eyes open. That was when it began to sink in. These weren't isolated incidents. They were just unacknowledged. The twist wasn't that he had seen something out of the ordinary. It was that so many others had, too, and they'd all been taught to look away. He dug deeper. Military forums. Obscure subreddits. Archive pages from long-defunct reconnaissance blogs. He found scattered references, barely coherent reports and anecdotes. Recurring terms started to form patterns. Pale skin. Silhouette mimics squad members. Missing gear, not personnel. Observed but never engaged. Climbs like it's boneless. Moves without noise. Then vanishes. And in one particularly disturbing post, dated 5 years earlier and tagged from a user stationed in Camp Dawson, West Virginia, there was a chilling entry that matched his own timeline. If you're doing night NAV and you hear someone racking a rifle, but no one claims it, don't check it out. Just leave. Don't look up. He read that sentence 5 times. Because that was exactly what had happened to him and Oscar in Bridgeport. The sound. The shape above the rocks. The strange precision of the disappearance. And then he remembered something else, something both men had downplayed at the time. Their gear. Tarps torn down. Boulders displaced. Stakes gone. He had told himself it was the wind, or maybe a prank. But what kind of prankster could move 100-pound rocks without leaving footprints? What jokester operates in silence, in full cold, in high-altitude snow? He was starting to accept something he didn't want to. These entities, whatever they were, weren't attacking. They were studying. Getting close. Gathering things. Testing reactions. Watching from the trees like scientists behind one-way glass. And there was one more thing. One thread that disturbed him more than anything else. It was buried in a testimony from an Army Ranger who'd rotated through Fort Polk in Louisiana. The Ranger described seeing a chalk-white figure crouched near the latrine perimeter, and he described it with one haunting phrase. It blinked out when I blinked. Like it knew when my eyes closed. Something about that detail tore a hole in his stomach. Not because of what it said, but what it implied. The timing. The awareness. Not a dumb animal reacting to noise or motion. But something that recognized the rhythms of human behavior. And then a realization, like ice water down his spine. What if it had been tracking him, not the other way around? Not for food. Not for fear. But just to see what he'd do. The rifle sound. The movement in the clearing. The sprint across the road. All of it could have been engineered. A controlled test. Like it wanted to know his thresholds. How long he'd freeze. How far he'd run. How much he could take before panicking. And he had passed every part of the test. Or failed it. He no longer knew which. What he did know was this. Every time he tried to convince himself it had been a dream, or a forest animal, or even just a trick of adrenaline, something would break that illusion. An email. A memory. A phrase he read from someone he'd never met that mirrored his exact experience word for word. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a pattern. And if it was a pattern, that meant it was real. And if it was real, Then they were still out there. Watching. Waiting. And maybe, next time, they wouldn't just study. The mind tries to find order in chaos. It claws for patterns, frameworks, some kind of internal consistency, especially after events that feel like they don't belong in the world we know. That's what haunted Oscar, the Marine from Bridgeport, and the lieutenant from Fort McCoy long after their respective encounters. The absence of a sensible cause. The absence of closure. So, for the sake of narrative, survival, or sanity, they began building theories. Let's start with Bridgeport. Oscar sat cross-legged on the cot in his bunk days after returning from the Mountain Warfare Training Center, a half-empty notebook laid open beside him. His handwriting had become tighter, more focused. For the past 2 nights, he'd been replaying the moment the tarp collapsed. Replaying the charging handle sound. The glint of light reflecting off something perched above the rock face. At the time, it had felt surreal, like something between a lucid dream and a waking hallucination. But when his sergeant confirmed the sighting, and when the gear turned up missing, the boundaries between paranoia and possibility started to blur. He sketched out diagrams. The tarp placement. The surrounding tree cover. The direction the sergeant had looked when he saw the figure. If it had climbed down from the tree, Oscar reasoned, the creature, or whatever it was, must have been above them the entire time. Watching. Waiting. Not just passing through, but stalking with purpose. One night, under the glow of a red-lensed flashlight, Oscar tested a theory. He hung his bayonet on a branch outside the barracks window and recorded the sound of a branch snapping under tension. Then, he racked the charging handle on his M4. He listened to both recordings again and again, playing them side by side through cheap headphones. They were similar. Not identical. But under fatigue, snow, darkness, and altitude, he could see how they might have confused the two. His stomach turned at the idea that the noise had come from directly above, not behind the tree as had assumed. Then came the environmental data. The animal packers who had spooked patrols with sudden, unannounced movements, perhaps an innocent explanation for previous ghost stories from the area. But that didn't account for the figure with the shining eyes. Nor did it explain the disappearance of rocks the size of human heads, used to secure the tarp. Oscar had hefted one of those stones himself. He remembered the strain on his arms. Someone, or something, had removed them silently in the middle of the night. He ran through the timeline again. They had returned from setting up the tarp. Snow began to fall. They went to sleep around 9 p.m. At 10, Oscar heard the noise. By dawn, the structure had collapsed and all anchoring objects had vanished. His sergeant's description still echoed in his head, bald, naked, crouched like it didn't care if it was seen, until it saw me looking. The instant recognition. The ducking. The predator behavior. And the weirdest part. No prints in the snow. No drag marks. No misplaced boot treads. Just silence and confusion. Now shift to Fort McCoy. The lieutenant had less time to build a formal theory, but the experience had embedded itself into his body. Every time he entered a tree line after that night, something inside him tensed, not just the usual caution of a trained soldier, but a visceral, irrational alarm. The image of that creature, thin, human-shaped, but grotesquely stretched, perched impossibly high on a broken stump, was seared into him. And the moment it scurried down and chased him through the underbrush, only to reappear 30 feet in the air later, staring from the trunk like a gargoyle. That had shattered any chance at rationalization. Still, he tried. He noted that it moved with speed but made almost no sound, like a cat or arboreal predator. When it scrambled, it scraped. But when it stalked, it moved silently. It had intent. Awareness. It wasn't just some animal that panicked and ran, it was watching him. Keeping pace. Timing its approach. And, bizarrely, it never attacked. That was the first behavioral clue. It wanted him to see it, but not to engage. He wondered whether it had followed him from the hillside. Had it waited in that broken tree, unmoving, while he rested with the skittles? Or had it arrived later, testing him, analyzing him? Why retreat just before the tree lean? Why flash its face again from the high branches above the road? There was a logic here, even if it wasn't human logic. He reached out to a few former peers, using vague language. Had anyone seen anything weird out there? Strange lights, odd animal calls, a figure in the trees. Mostly, he got silence or jokes. But one guy, a retired NCO who had served back in the 90s, responded simply, "If it didn't kill you, consider that a warning shot." McCoy's always had eyes. Cryptic. Unhelpful. But haunting. So, what are we left with? Two separate encounters. Two different training environments. Two highly trained military personnel, not prone to fantasy. Both incidents involve creatures that resemble humans but aren't. Both involve unnatural agility, silent movement, tree-based stalking behavior. Both involve timing, appearing, vanishing, reappearing. Both involve restraint, an ability to get close, very close, without making contact. There's a word Oscar kept circling in his notes: mimicry. The pale crawler, if that's what this is, doesn't just hide, it mimics. It mimics posture. Size. The outline of a human figure perched in a tree. The sound of a rifle being handled. The crouch of a patrolman in the dark. It doesn't roar. It doesn't charge. It mimics, waits, and disappears. Which implies one more horrifying thing. It learns. The reconstruction, if we dare call it that, goes something like this. The creature may have been monitoring patrols for days, even weeks. Watching human behaviors. Observing equipment and voices. Memorizing routines. It picked moments of exhaustion and isolation to make contact. Not to kill. But to test. Oscar's team was acclimating to altitude. They were already compromised: less oxygen, less sleep, lower reaction time. The tarps gave the creature concealment. The tree gave it elevation. It mimicked a familiar noise to gauge reactions. When confronted, it withdrew, but not without leaving a mark, disrupting gear, scattering boulders, forcing confusion. At Fort McCoy, the creature waited in the clearing. It positioned itself above the soldier, using height to disorient. When approached, it didn't flee like prey. It pivoted. Stared. Scared him. Then retreated, but not without pursuing him across terrain, pushing him until he broke into a sprint. And even then, it wasn't done. It watched from above. It showed its face again, deliberately, as if to say, "I'm still here. And I could have done more." This behavior is not random. It's not some fluke or mass hallucination. These beings, or this being, operate with a cold precision. A kind of field test, perhaps. Or a message. Not everything out there wants to be understood. The final piece of reconstruction isn't about tactics or biology. It's about psychology. Every element of these encounters suggests something designed to rattle the human mind. Shadows. Sounds. Eye contact. Isolation. These creatures aren't just physical threats, they are psychological intrusions. They rewrite what's acceptable, what's normal. They change the rules of the field. And that may be their real weapon. If you ask Oscar now what happened, he won't say, "A monster attacked us." He'll say, "Something studied us. Played with us." And if you ask the lieutenant from Wisconsin, he won't say, "I saw a cryptid." He'll say, "I was baited. Followed. Evaluated." And maybe that's the most terrifying reconstruction of all. These encounters weren't random. They were rehearsals. It always starts to unravel when you return to normalcy. That quiet moment when the world resumes its routines, and the terrifying event you just lived through begins to dissolve into memory, into dream. That's when the doubt creeps in. And the breakdown isn't always explosive. Sometimes it's quiet. Slow. A silent splitting at the edges of your trust in reality. Oscar felt it first in the locker room. A week after returning from Bridgeport, after the gear was returned, after the mandatory reports were filed and shelved. He sat on the cold bench in front of his locker, boots off, socks damp from the morning PT. He stared down at the grooves in the rubber floor mat, remembering the way the tarp collapsed in the snow. Remembering the sound. That metallic racking of the M4. Or was it a branch? Or just a dream, stirred into existence by too many nights without sleep? He glanced up at the mirror over the sink. For a split second, he thought he saw something over his own shoulder. A pale glint. But it was gone just as fast. Just fluorescent light bouncing off steel. That's what he told himself. A few lockers down, Water Dog was laughing with someone about a new attachment for his bayonet. The same guy who swore it wasn't him that night. The same guy who hadn't seemed rattled at all afterward. Maybe he hadn't seen what Oscar had seen. Maybe he was faking it. Or maybe Oscar was the one who'd misread everything. At Fort McCoy, the lieutenant went quiet. 4 weeks. No journal entries. No confessions. He continued to show up to drill, met his quotas, stayed professional. But the fire he'd once had, that steady confidence in field leadership, it started to dim. His squad noticed first. Then his XO. Then the evaluations came in. Cautious. Deliberate. Sometimes unfocused. He'd wake up at 3 a.m. sometimes, drenched in sweat, the shape of the creature still burned behind his eyelids. That strange, elongated torso crouched against the silhouette of the tree. The moment the red light caught its limbs. The scraping sound. He heard it in branches now. At the edge of parking lots. Out his apartment window on windless nights. He bought a new knife. Larger. Serrated. Not for show. He slept with it under his pillow. When people asked why he jogged with a flashlight in daylight, he just said, habit. The military doesn't have a system for debriefing the inexplicable. You can report contraband. You can report misconduct. You can file a safety hazard. But there's no form for saw something that shouldn't exist, and it followed me. Oscar tried once. He typed up a draft message to his staff sergeant. Short. Straightforward. About Bridgeport. I think there was someone or something there. Not an animal. Not a hallucination. We need to check the area. Or send someone to verify. I can't let this go. He deleted it. Because what if it was just in his head? That word kept coming back, hallucination. They'd been briefed on it. High-altitude pulmonary issues. Oxygen deprivation. Stress-induced delusions. But hallucinations don't move tarps. They don't steal rocks. They don't stare back with eyes that reflect moonlight. Still, Oscar began cross-referencing everything. He pulled training logs from past Bridgeport deployments. He found 3 unrelated incidents, all classified as shelter interference. One involved a small rock slide. One listed missing pack mule. The third said only, disturbance during fire watch, investigation inconclusive. He felt himself slipping deeper into obsession. At Fort McCoy, the lieutenant found himself doing the same thing. On a rare weekend off, he drove alone to a public trail near the training site. Parked his car. Walked the edge of the forest where he'd seen the creature. It looked ordinary. Sunlight warmed the trees. Birds chirped. Not a single trace of that dread. Not until he found the stump. Still split. Still standing. He walked to the base and stared up at it. He tried to picture what he'd seen. Reconstruct the night. He even climbed a nearby embankment to mimic the angle he remembered. Was it possible someone had played a prank? A cadet in camo? But no one could have moved like that. And who would keep a prank going long enough to follow someone for 10 minutes through brush, then climb a tree just to watch them again? He reached out to a retired SEER instructor he trusted. Over a drink, he asked, "You ever seen something in the woods that you couldn't explain?" The man took a long sip. Then, without smiling, answered, "You asking if I've seen it, or if I've ignored it?" That stuck with him. Oscar, meanwhile, began experiencing what he could only describe as echoes. Not visions. Not dreams. Just moments when his body would react before his mind could. Walking past a tree and instinctively flinching. Hearing metal scrape on a vehicle and tensing like it was a charging handle. He started second-guessing his senses. Was he broken? Was this PTSD? Was it something else? At night, he'd lie in bed and try to recreate the exact sound that woke him in Bridgeport. Over and over. Until sleep came like a blackout. Dreamless. Heavy. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was uncertainty. Not knowing if what he remembered was real. Not knowing whether something was still out there. Watching. Learning. Waiting. The breakdown wasn't the creature. The breakdown was what came after. The silence. The not knowing. The slow erosion of certainty. And maybe that's the point. Maybe these things, whatever they are, don't want to kill you. Maybe they want you to live with it. Maybe the real damage isn't the chase through the woods, or the gear pulled down in the night. Maybe the real damage is that from then on, you can never fully relax again. You can never fully believe the night is empty. You can never fully trust the silence. That's the truth of it. These creatures, if they exist, don't just haunt forests. They haunt certainty. And that breaks people in ways no weapon ever could. There's something that happens to your memory when you try to make sense of the impossible. You either shrink it down to a shape that fits your understanding of the world, or you set it aside, wrap it in mental caution tape, and leave it untouched. That's where both of these men seem to have arrived, not at certainty, but at survival. And sometimes, that's all you need. For the Marine in Bridgeport, what haunted him wasn't the presence itself, but the silence afterward. The unanswered questions. The missing rocks. The fact that something could creep up that close, so deliberately, so quietly, and not be detected by the kind of men trained to notice the slightest inconsistency. And what kind of creature watches you from a ledge, then vanishes like it was never there at all? But even more unsettling than the sighting was the feeling. That instinctual tension in the gut that says you're not alone. That primal warning you can't justify with facts or evidence but can't ignore either. It's the same feeling passed down by countless generations who knew, long before radar or satellites, that some threats don't wear uniforms, or show up on maps. The guardsman at Fort McCoy didn't tell anyone either, not really. Not the full story. What could he say? That he saw something not quite human. That it climbed like no person could, stared without blinking, moved through the woods as if it were born from them. That when it looked at him, it wasn't curious, it was calculating. You say something like that, and the best-case scenario is a psych eval. The worst? You're dismissed. Laughed at. Isolated. So you do what soldiers have always done, you tell a version of the truth that people can live with. Got lost. Saw something weird. You leave out the part about the face behind the tree. The pale, ovular head watching you from 30 feet up. You don't mention the speed. Or how it moved without sound, unless it wanted you to hear it. You file it away. And years later, in a quiet moment, alone in your house, maybe standing at a window while the trees sway just a little too much, you remember. You feel it again. Not the fear exactly, but the certainty that there are still pieces of the world that don't fit. That nature, even in the places we think we've mapped and conquered, still holds things older than us, smarter than us, or just less interested in being understood. And that's the truth neither of them could shake. Not the sight, but the implication, that if these things wanted to harm them, they easily could have. They weren't just strange. They were restrained. Which begs the question, what were they waiting for? This is what turns a one-time experience into a long-term ache. The unknown becomes a kind of echo. Not loud, but persistent. A subtle distortion in the way you look at tree lines, at moonlight, at broken branches in the dark. We call them rakes. Hail crawlers. Wendigos. Skinwalkers. But these names are only placeholders, lids we screw on tight over things we don't want to spill. We hope classification will grant control. It rarely does. And for those who've encountered them, not online, but out there, in the raw hush of the wilderness, the worst part is knowing how few people will ever believe them. So they say nothing. Or they say just enough to see who nods a little too slowly. Who looks away a second too long. Who's heard something too. So if you're listening to this now, maybe from the comfort of your home, maybe near a window or a wooded lot, ask yourself this: have you ever felt watched? Really watched? Not by a person. Not even by an animal. But by something that shouldn't be there. Something intelligent. Still. Silent. Waiting. If you have, welcome to the club no one wants to join. And if you haven't, pray it stays that way. Even now, years later, I still flinch at certain sounds, branches creaking overhead, the scrape of something moving just outside my field of vision. Not because I'm still afraid exactly, but because the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. There's a part of you that stays out there, in the dark, crouched low in the brush, heart thudding behind your ribs like it's trying to escape. It would be easy to say it was a hallucination. That what we experienced in Bridgeport, or out there in Fort McCoy, was nothing more than the altitude or sleep deprivation playing tricks on the brain. But the details remain too sharp, too consistent across stories that were never supposed to intersect. These were different men, in different regions, separated by thousands of miles and years. And yet, they saw the same thing. A pale, emaciated figure. Long limbs. Sunken, unreadable eyes. A shape that moved like instinct before form. Something that wasn't human, but watched us with a patience that felt disturbingly familiar. And then it's gone. That's the thing, isn't it? There's no confrontation. No discovery. Just a moment of tension, a flicker in the corner of your eye, and then, absence. We're left staring at broken branches or disturbed gear, trying to put the pieces together in the quiet. Trying to convince ourselves it didn't happen the way we remember. But it did. In the months that followed, I tried to bring it up with others. Not directly, not in the way that would get you laughed out of the barracks. But in quiet conversations, late nights on watch or shared cigarettes after hours. I'd ask if they'd ever felt watched out there. Ever heard something they couldn't explain. Most of the time, I got a laugh and a shake of the head. But once in a while, just once in a while, someone's expression would falter. Their smile wouldn't reach their eyes. And they'd say, "Yeah. I've had something like that." No one ever elaborates. No one wants to be the first one to say it out loud. Because once you do, you can't take it back. You can't put the lid back on the jar. The truth is, the military doesn't like mysteries. It likes clean answers, standard operating procedures, post-mission reports. But how do you document something that has no tracks, no fingerprints, no footage? How do you account for a thing that unzips the rules of reality just long enough to let you look inside, and then seals itself shut again? There's no rulebook for that. So you move on. You do the work. You write down unknown disturbance, minor equipment loss, or animal activity. And then you file it away and hope no one asks questions you can't answer. But the questions don't go away. Was it trying to communicate? Was it studying us? Or was it just curious? We assume malevolence, because fear is the easiest lens to look through. But what if it wasn't a predator? What if it was something else entirely, something ancient, displaced, or simply beyond us? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what if it wasn't alone? There are stories, far more than anyone wants to admit, circulating in the quiet corners of the military. Stories that never make it into official reports. Creatures in the trees. Figures on the ridgeline. Sounds that mimic familiar voices but come from the wrong direction. And every story ends the same way: silence. Denial. A soldier staring out into the dark and not liking what stares back. I'm not saying it was a rake. Or a skinwalker. Or anything else you can look up on the internet and argue about on Reddit. I'm saying that we were there, and something else was too. Something real. And that's where it ends. No body. No footprint. No final shot fired. Just the memory. The unanswered questions. And the lingering feeling that next time, maybe, we won't be so lucky. So what do you do with that? You go back to your life. You drink. You laugh. You train. You raise your kids and mow the lawn, and you don't talk about it anymore. But sometimes, when the air gets too still, or you catch the glint of moonlight in just the wrong way, you remember. And for just a moment, the world doesn't feel so safe anymore. That's what they leave out of the pamphlets. That sometimes, the things you face aren't insurgents or hostile fire. Sometimes, the battlefield isn't even human. And if you're out there, on night watch, in the tree line, walking point, keep your eyes open. Keep your rifle close. And whatever you do, don't assume you're alone. Because out there, in the places even maps forget, something's still watching. Waiting.